Good evening, families, friends, teachers, community, school leaders, and students. If you're a student joining us tonight, we're so happy that you're with us. This is a unique event. It's an inaugural joint event this evening. Some of you may know us through Classical U. Maybe you have taken some training courses through Classical U. Some of you may know us through Scholé Communities because you're a homeschooling co-op that has joined us through support with Scholé Communities, or some of you may know us through Scholé Academy. Hi, families of Scholé Academy. Whatever has led you to us, or if you're just a lover of good stories, we're so happy that you're with us this evening. Classical Academic Press has been honored to serve families, educators, students, and schools in the renewal of classical education. And these various arms of Classical Academic Press that I've mentioned have, in their own way, offered different events to families. Classical U has offered live learning events very frequently every month, and that is often co-sponsored by Scholé Communities, which is our network of homeschool and hybrid communities. Meanwhile, Scholé Academy has been someone that offers K-12 online courses for families all around the world, and we have offered various lecture hall events and so forth. This evening's event is our first ever joint combined event, and we're so happy to welcome you. I can think of no better thing to bring us together than good stories. I am Dr. Joylyn Blake. I serve as the director for Scholé Academy, and I'm especially delighted to be the host for tonight's event because we welcome, as I said, not only a great storyteller, but my dear friend, Dr. Anika Prather. I will give you a fuller introduction of her with her full bio in just a minute. But again, as people are still logging on, I hope you'll indulge me and give me the opportunity to give you a few announcements so that you'll know, hey, if I really enjoyed what we heard tonight or some things piqued my interest, you'll have action steps to know what you can follow up on. Now, I want to say first that throughout the evening, as you hear Dr. Prather tell her lovely stories, if you have questions, we invite them. Go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. That Q&A box will be where we gather your questions, gather your feedback, gather your interest, and then there'll be a time at the end where we speak to those questions. And Dr. Prather will give special attention to your curiosities. So, first announcement. If you would like to see and meet Dr. Prather in real life, flesh and blood, and not just through a Zoom screen, she will be in Phoenix, Arizona at the end of this month. That's March 20th through the 22nd. It's the National Symposium for Classical Education in Phoenix, Arizona. Some of you may be familiar with this event. In addition, the president of Classical Academic Press, Joelle Hodge, will be there as well. So you can meet these, or at least see these ladies and gaze upon them from afar, but they will be there, and we want to draw your attention to that. As we draw your attention to these things, you can notice in the chat, there will be links that you can click on if something piques your interest and you want to follow up on it. My friend Rebecca Richards will be populating things in the chat for you to follow up on. So, second announcement, if what you hear from Dr. Prather this evening interests you and you want to follow up in reading or in study or just in great literature, I invite you to check out her book, co-authored, called The Black Intellectual Tradition and the Great Conversation. That is a course you can take on Classical U, or you can buy the physical copy of the book, both produced by Classical Academic Press. Also, other courses you might be interested in on Classical U are Women in the Liberal Arts Tradition. That's a new course that's released. We also have a course called On Teaching Fairy Stories by Dr. Junius Johnson. And we have a course called Awakening the Moral Imagination Through Fairy Tales and Stories. So all of these courses are offered on Classical U. And if you are interested and want to know more and you haven't even heard of Classical you can go and consider our subscription right now. There's a special deal so that if you fill out a brief survey, you can get 15% off of an annual subscription. I kind of call it the Classical Educators Netflix. It is training and just rich, amazing content that gives you all kinds of good information to stream, to learn from, and to enhance, whether it's your own individual learning or whether it's for an entire school that you want to train your educators. Classical U is a great resource for that. And as I said, I serve as the director of Scully Academy, which is our online course provider, serving largely homeschool families. And at Scully Academy, we offer courses a la carte. So you can enroll your child in one courses or a slew of them, depending on what your needs are. So I invite you to check out all the offerings: Latin, logic, the study of Russian, great literature, history, math, sciences, and all kinds of things in between are available for K-12 students to enroll. So I invite you to check us out at Scully Academy. And last but not least of the announcements, registrants from tonight's event will receive the recording. It will be sent via email to you, so you'll get to delight in and enjoy this later as well. And you will be the first to get the communication about Dr. Prather's Griot audio recordings that will be coming out later from Classical Academic Press. You will be notified when those are available. So, that was long-winded announcements, all to lead up to the keynote speaker at tonight's event and what we all came to hear. And I want to just give you her brief bio. No amount of reading could really cover the territory and the lives that this woman has touched and continues to minister to. But I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Anika Prather and then hand it off to her. Dr. Anika T. Prather earned her BA from Howard University in elementary education. She also has earned several graduate degrees in education from New York University and from Howard University. She has a master's in liberal arts from St. John's College in Annapolis and a PhD in English, theater, and literacy education from the University of Maryland. Her research focus is on building literacy with African American students through engagement in the books of the canon. And she self-published her book, Living in the Constellation of the Canon, the lived experiences of African American students reading great books literature. I can vouch for that one. I actually used it in my own doctoral research and I didn't even know it at the time. She is the co-author for The Black Intellectual Tradition with Dr. Angel Parham, who also joins her in our Classical U course, and that is published by Classical Academic Press. Dr. Prather has served as a teacher, supervisor for student teachers, a director of education, and a head of school. Currently, she is a highly sought-after speaker on the topic of the relevancy of classical studies to the Black community, and I would say to all communities. She has served as a director of high-quality curriculum and instruction at Johns Hopkins University, and she's the founder of the Living Water School located in Southern Maryland. The Living Water School is a unique Christian school for independent learners that's based on the educational philosophies of classical education and the Sudbury model. In the spring of 2022, Anika and her husband Damon opened the Living Water Center, where activities for the Living Water School, book talks, and other events are hosted. The Living Water Center, that's located in Old Town, Alexandria, also houses the Blacks in Classics Museum, which is open to the public on Saturdays and Sundays for visitors to see original artwork featuring Blacks who have been inspired by classics and the works of the canon. She's married to Damon Prather, who is an engineer with an MBA who also serves as the financial manager of their school. She and her husband Damon have 3 young children, and they reside in the DC metropolitan area. Like I said, just scratches the surface of this amazing woman and what she has done. And Dr. Prather, we are delighted, thrilled, and highly anticipating the beautiful voice you'll bring to the stories this evening. So with that, I hand it to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here to share a couple of stories with you of those who have read from the classical tradition. And I like to call myself, I haven't publicized this yet because I want to make sure it'll work, but the classical griot. There are so many stories of the African American experience, so many parts of our life that we don't really know. And this story of the Black intellectual tradition is one of those best kept secrets. But as I have gone deeper into understanding it, it has changed my whole perspective on just American history, US history, human history, as I see how the classical tradition has woven us all together. Because as African Americans brought their stories in conversation with the classical tradition, we've got new stories that tell about the human experience. And so today I'm going to tell you 2 stories. And we're going to start off with the story of Phyllis Wheatley. Now, I'm excited about these stories because I'm trying to compile all these stories in a book that hopefully someone will publish, so that every parent, teacher, anyone, and it's written very clearly, very easy to understand. Um, each chapter tells a different story of an African American who was inspired by the classical tradition. And each story tells how and why they were inspired by the classical tradition. And I created it for teachers. It's going to also include original artwork from the same artists we use at the Blacks and Classics Museum. So you'll see a portrait of each person. And it's just a way for you to have a resource so that as you're teaching the classical tradition, you can be able to show your young people this tradition is for everyone. And I'm hoping that this will start like a series of all different other ethnicities that have engaged with the classical tradition, but I'm starting with my own community. So today we're going to start off with Phyllis Wheatley. Now, Phyllis Wheatley lived in West Africa, and she was just barely 7 years old. They say her 2 front teeth were missing, and that's how they know how young she was. Now, can you imagine? We don't know quite how she ended up on that slave ship, but somehow she was captured and taken and put on a slave ship headed for Boston, Massachusetts. Now imagine a little 7-year-old girl all alone on a great big ship crossing the ocean. No mother, no father, no grandmother, no grandfather, no big brother, no big sister, no one there to protect her. Now, I just got back from a cruise. My husband celebrated his 50th birthday on a great big carnival cruise. And I have 3 children, ages 10, 11, and 13. And I tell you, I had anxiety about losing my children on that ship. So I was always yelling and screaming, Dylan, where are you? Day, where are you? My daughter's name is Day. Destin, where are you? I was always right there. Myself and my husband were always right there to make sure they were safe. And sometimes I would get so scared, and my daughter would say, Mom, I'm right here. And she'd be sitting right next to me. But Phyllis did not have that. She was alone, unprotected. And she wasn't on the ship in a room where she could lay down and get rest and feel safe and cozy. She was thrown down into the very bottom of the ship and chained to strangers, men and women, maybe even from people who were from tribes that didn't like her tribe. And then she was there with the slave catchers who were planning to sell her. And we don't know what happened to her on that ship. And she wasn't on that ship for just a day or 2. She was on that ship for weeks, all alone, 7 years old. Maybe there was a storm out in the ocean and the boat would rock back and forth. And she could hear the lightning, see the lightning and hear the thunder. And she was afraid. And maybe she cried out, "Mommy, Mommy, where are you?" And no one was there to make poor little Phyllis feel safe. We know nothing about Phyllis's life except she has one memory of watching her mother get up in the morning to pray to the gods. That is the only memory she had. For whatever happened on that ship was so traumatic, so frightening, that she wiped every memory from herself. But she was strong. She may have been afraid. She may have been only 7, but she survived. They arrived in Boston. They put her on the auction block, and there she was, stripped down to nothing. And she was pitiful. She was afraid. She looked so sad. In fact, Phyllis looked so afraid and so sad that a slave master named John Wheatley was passing by the auction, and he saw this precious little girl on the auction block looking terrified, and his heart broke for her. Now, this man had owned slaves forever, but for whatever reason, God made it so that when he saw Phyllis, he felt sorrow. And it is said that he purchased her just to protect her. And we're not going to excuse the fact that he owned slaves, but we are going to honor the fact that he was moved to save Phyllis's life. And he brought Phyllis home, and they loved her like a daughter. And they homeschooled her right along with their children. And they gave her a classical education. And Phyllis Wheatley was so excited about this education she was receiving that in 18 months, she learned English, Latin, and Greek. And she read Aristotle, and she read the Greek myths, and the Greek tragedies, and the Roman comedies. She read everything. And then, as she began to read, something began to stir within her. Those stories, those dialogues with Socrates, those parts of animals from Aristotle, those plays from Euripides, the stories of Zeus and the Muses began to take shape within her soul. And from that, she began to write her own poetry. And the words just flooded up from the very depths of her soul and gave her the voice she needed to share with the world her story. Phyllis tells her story in her poetry. She tells the story of Niobe, who lost her children. And she tells, in this poem, tells of how Niobe weeps for the loss of her children. And when we read that poem, we wonder, is she writing about her mother? Does she know that her mother cried out for her, wept for her, that she called her name? And her name in Africa was not Phyllis. But we don't know what her real name was because Phyllis wiped it from her memory. But when she got to America, they named her after the ship that brought her to America. So for her whole life, her name will remind her of the trauma of being ripped from the love of her mother. But she did not forget her mother, for she wrote about her mother when she talked about how Niobe wept for her children, and Phyllis knew my mother probably wept for me. She told her story. And as those stories took shape, and as she read not just the Greek tragedies and other Greek texts, Phyllis loved God. She read the Bible and she had a deep faith in the Lord. And she found inspiration in the Bible. And one of her favorite stories was the story of David and Goliath. And as she read that story, a poem was formed within her soul, and out came Goliath of Gath. And in this poem, we can tell that Phyllis is telling her story of how, even though she has gone through so much, she will overcome her pain. Just like David overcame Goliath and struck him down, she will find freedom. John and Susan Wheatley loved Phyllis. They were so proud of her. They began to save her poems so that they wouldn't be lost, so no one could claim them. There's another poem that began to well up. As Phyllis would read about the Greek gods and the mighty power of Zeus, she began to think of George Washington, our first president. Before he even became president, he was appointed to lead in the Revolutionary War, and Phyllis Wheatley was inspired by his greatness that she wrote a poem just for him, sending him off with the power of the gods to defeat those who want to keep us from being a free country. And she sent that poem to George Washington. And George Washington read this poem, and he could not believe this from a slave girl. And he wrote her a letter, and he says to her, "You have been gifted by the muses. I am your humble servant." George Washington? Why, wasn't he the one who also owned slaves? Slave owners are very complex individuals. But he reached out to Phyllis. And that was just the beginning of Phyllis using her gift of writing to inspire those who were fighting for America's independence. But one thing she tried to make people remember in her poems and in her letters is that as you fight for your freedom, don't forget me. Don't forget my people, for we want to be free too. Well, word got around that there was this gifted young girl who could write this poetry. And there was a man who said, "I don't believe it. There is no way a Black girl could be that smart, for they're only slaves. They're meant to serve us like our cows and our donkeys. There's no way this young girl could write such beautiful poetry. Someone else has written it for her." And so John and Susan Wheatley were just appalled. How dare he not believe our precious Phyllis is this brilliant, gifted poetess? So they had an idea. They called all their friends together to their home. Come see our beautiful Phyllis write and read her poetry. Come everyone. And they called all of their friends together in their home. And there they watched young Phyllis write her poetry, share her poetry. And then John and Susan Wheatley said, "We want to make sure that from now and forever, the world always knows that our precious Phyllis is a poet." So, all of you guests here, come, here's a pen. Here, take this pen. And I want each of you to sign her first manuscript. And you verify that our Phyllis wrote these poems so no one will ever claim her poetry. No one will ever forget her. And one by one, each visitor to their home signed their name. Signed their name, one after another. What is this? Why, this signature looks very familiar. And it said, John Hancock. John Hancock? He signed her poetry? All of these people together, even those who signed our early American documents, signed off on Phyllis Wheatley's poetry to prove to Thomas Jefferson and the world that this young girl was truly one of the greatest poets who ever lived. Her poetry was published. Forever written in stone, she would be the author, the first Black person published in America. The Wheatleys set her free, and she wanted to write more. But after her freedom, after being away from the Wheatleys, they passed away, they died, and Phyllis Wheatley was left alone in the world. She had gotten married, but the man she married did not take very good care of her. Maybe he too was in pain from his trials as a Black man in America, that he was unable to take on the responsibility of caring for his wife. They had children and they all died. Phyllis Wheatley ended up having to work as a maid just to have a place to lay her head and food to eat. And as a very young woman, she tried again to get a second book of poetry published. But with no one there to protect her and to help her, no one would publish poetry. And Phyllis Wheatley, that beautiful, brave young girl, died sickly as a young woman with no children and no husband, but she left us this beautiful book of poetry so we never, ever forget her. And that's the story of Phyllis Wheatley. Does anyone have any questions about Phyllis Wheatley before I go on to the next story? Well, I'll keep going and we can save questions for the end. Now, we're going to hear about Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass is a little different. He wasn't born in Africa. He was born to an enslaved woman. And as soon as he was born, he was taken and put on another plantation far away from his mother. Now, his mother was the only enslaved person who knew how to read and write in the area where they lived in Maryland. And she loved Frederick Douglass so much. Oh, she just adored her little boy. She adored him so much that even though he was taken from her and put on another plantation, as soon as she finished working in the fields, she would walk miles to be able to put him to bed at night. And she did this just about every night until he was about 5 years old. And sometimes I wonder, why? Why would she risk her life like that? Why would she work all day and instead of going back to her cabin to rest so she could get ready for the next day, she would go to put Frederick Douglass to sleep? Can you imagine with me? When I was pregnant and then after I had my children, I always read to my children. In fact, my son, my firstborn son, his first word was read. He would grab a book, toddle over, and throw it in your face and say, read. And so I imagine that if Frederick Douglass's mother knew how to read, maybe, just maybe, it's a theory, let's imagine together that she walked all night just to get to her son so that she could pass on the gift of reading to him. And she would get to that cabin where he was, and she would take him in her arms and cuddle him close, my baby, my only baby. I want you to know my stories. I want to awaken curiosity in you. I want you to know about reading. And she must have maybe told him stories. Maybe under her dress, she had hidden a book that she took from the master's library and said, I'm going to take this book to Frederick and I'm going to read it to him. Frederick thinks, if you read his second autobiography, he believes that it was his mother who first taught him how to read. A lot of times we hear his story and we hear about how the master's wife taught him how to read. But Frederick believes, even though he didn't have a great memory, that it was his mother who started the process. And I think I want to believe him, and I'm going to tell you why. Frederick Douglass's mother died when he was about 5, somewhere between 5 and 7 years old, and he never saw her again. But she left something in him. Something in his eyes, they say, was sparked. They could tell his eyes were very curious and bright, and you could see he was a child of high intelligence. In fact, his look was so fierce that it made the slave masters say, I don't know about this kid. He's a little different. He makes me a little nervous. Well, not only were the slave masters kind of interested and concerned about his curiosity, but the slave master's wife, now the slave master's wife was new. She had newly married him. And before that, she had never owned slaves. So when she first married Frederick Douglass's master, she just assumed Frederick was just any other little boy. And she saw Frederick Douglass. And she saw his beautiful face and his beautiful brown curly hair and these great big curious eyes. And she noticed him and she said, what a gorgeous little boy. Oh my goodness, you look just so smart. I must teach you how to read. So she began to teach him phonics and how to put those letters together to make words and how to make those words make sentences and how to write and how to master the English language. And Frederick Douglass and the master's wife were so engrossed in this activity of mastering literacy that they didn't notice the master come in the room and say, what is going on here? And in shock, the master's wife said, well, he's so smart. I thought I would just teach him how to read. And he said, oh, no, 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 no. You don't teach an enslaved person how to read. If you teach them to read, they won't want to be a slave. If they become so smart, they'll think I'm not supposed to work. They'll become dissatisfied. No, no, no. Put that away. You must stop that, please. No. You give him a little bit of knowledge, he'll think he'll rule the world. Stop this. Stop, 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 stop right now. And so the master's wife said, oh, darling, I didn't know. He was just so adorable. And he looked like he really wanted to learn. I don't care. He is fit for one thing, and that's to serve us. Do not teach him to read. And at that moment, she stopped. Now, Frederick Douglass was 6 years old when this conversation happened. And I can imagine him sitting there with his intelligent self, looking at the master, looking at the wife, as they argued back and forth. And the whole time, little Frederick Douglass is thinking and he's listening. He's very smart. And as he listened to the master tell how if you give him reading, teach him how to read, he won't be satisfied to be a slave. At 6 years old, Frederick Douglass said, then I must learn how to read. And he said, I decided at that moment, as I saw these two arguing over whether or not I should read, that at any cost, I would teach myself to read. Now, I have children. Okay. I don't know, none of them, and they're all pretty smart. They all love reading now. But at 6 years old, none of them were deciding I'm going to teach myself to read. Matter of fact, my oldest son, I'm never going to read. I'm going to learn everything on YouTube or television. And we had to have a long talk about that. He loves to read now. But Frederick Douglass, an enslaved child, separated from his mother with no father, mother, no roots, no, he didn't even know his own birthday. He didn't even know his last name. Frederick Douglass actually made up his whole name, even made up his own birthday. He had no roots, but he still knew he needed this skill. So from the time he was 6 up to about 12 years old, he worked hard. He had all types of tricks. Sometimes he would see the master's children and their friends, and he would say, hey, 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 I bet I can write an S better than you. And they would say, oh, you are enslaved. There's no way you can write better than me. And then Douglass would say, oh, I bet I can. And then they would write the letters, and Douglass would copy the letters. And this just went on until he was learning how to write. And he had all, I mean, one time he was working in the shipyard as a teenager. And he would take the pieces of wood in the shipyard and form letters. When he was about 12 years old, he had pretty much mastered reading and writing. And he said, I need a book. I need a book that I can study. And he noticed that there was one textbook that all the children had at their school. It was a very common book in early American schools called the Columbian Orator. And Douglass was very smart. He would do little odd jobs to earn a little extra change, a little money. Even as an enslaved person, he would keep his little money. And he happened to be in town in Baltimore, and he saw a Methodist bookstore, and he went in there and he saw the Columbian Orator. Now, it was against the law to give or sell books to the enslaved people. They were not allowed to own books. And if a white person sold a black person a book, they could get fined or go to jail. And if a black person was caught with a book, I don't even want to say, there might be children here, but horrible things would happen to you if you were caught with a book or caught writing. But Douglass snuck into this Methodist bookstore. He looked both ways, looked up and down the street, making sure nobody was looking. And he went to the shop owner. Now, Douglass was so smart. He knew something was special about the Methodists because the Methodists, the founder, John Wesley, was adamantly against slavery. So he knew that if he went to this Methodist bookstore, he might find an ally. So he sneaks in and he picks up this Columbian Orator because he knew that this was a book that all of those kids used at school. And the man who owned the bookstore, he too looked around. And he says, listen, I'm going to sell you this book, but you can't tell anybody where you got it from. And that is how Frederick Douglass got the Columbian Orator. And he took that book and he hid it in his shirt. He ran back to his slave cabin on the plantation and he opened it up. And there he saw such beautiful excerpts of various pieces of literature from the Western canon. And it says, in the darkness of his soul, when he thought he would forever be a slave, when he got the Columbian Orator, the light of hope began to burn within him as he read the different literature. And there was one piece in particular called Dialogue Between a Master and His Slave. And in this dialogue, the slave convinced the master with words, with logic to set him free. And when Frederick Douglass read that, he said, I can do that. I can use logic to get to freedom. Soon, at 20 years old, his second time trying to escape to freedom. The first time, one of his enslaved friends told on him. The second time, he did it. And he got to freedom. And he married the woman who helped buy his train ticket and helped him get to freedom. And he began to establish himself in the North. He joined the abolitionist movement. And as a part of the abolitionist movement, he began to speak all over the country, all over the world. Douglass's story is really long, so I'm giving you the shorter version, but I hope you'll read about it for yourself. And he became really popular. He became so popular that Abraham Lincoln said, who is this Frederick Douglass I keep hearing about? Before long, he and Frederick Douglass were in conversation. And Frederick Douglass began to give Lincoln advice about the Civil War. And at Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, when he won the presidency the second time, after the Civil War had ended, when it was over, after his speech was over, he wanted Frederick Douglass to come visit him at his party, and people wouldn't let him in. Can't let this black man in here. But Abraham Lincoln saw him in the distance. He said, "Ah, Frederick, come here. You're my friend." And they let Frederick Douglass in. And this is what Abraham Lincoln said to Frederick Douglass. "Oh, Frederick, I'm so glad you came to hear my speech. What do you think? You know I trust your opinion so much." Not long after that, Abraham Lincoln died. But Frederick Douglass continued his work, speaking and fighting for the equality of all people. And he lived to be almost 80 years old. And behind, he left like 3 autobiographies, so many speeches, and a whole legacy of wisdom on how we all can live in harmony here in America as equal citizens. And that's the story of Frederick Douglass.
If we were in a cavernous auditorium, there would be uproarious applause. The spotlight would come center stage, roses would be thrown. Thank you, Dr. Prather. It's
Thank you.
just so beautiful and moving, and I'm glad I got to have my camera off at first because I was getting choked up. It
Mhm.
was really so beautifully told. So, if I may, I would like to ask the first question.
Sure.
And that is, these narratives are addressed in the book, the Black intellectual tradition.
Mhm.
Telling them has a different kind of power,
Yes.
the speaking of them. And as we know, a griot is a storyteller.
Yes.
So I want to ask you, what is the importance of the oral tradition, not just the written tradition?
Yes.
The oral tradition, what does that do for us?
It brings them alive.
Mm.
This is why, I have my background in theater, and I studied storytelling at NYU, and I love storytelling because it brings these stories alive. It's beyond a theoretical understanding, but we give voice to them. I'm hoping that as I told them, you could almost imagine. That's why I purposely did not show photos and things, because I'm hoping that you could actually imagine them as living beings.
Yes, and in light of that, and then and I invite all of you who are with us, go ahead and populate that Q&A box. We'll grasp those, populate the chat with all your accolades too, whatever. We welcome your comments. But something, Anika, that stood out to me was even at the very beginning when you kind of juxtaposed the cruise ship that your family was on and the slave ship that Phyllis was on. And how in some respects that cruise ship gave you some level of connection because you understood the rough seas, you understood
Yes.
some things that were unsettling.
Yes.
But then in the luxuries of our modern times, in some way, it totally distances and
Yes.
insulates from an understanding, right?
Yes.
So my question for you is, have you found connection points for people in this day when we can be so insulated from past realities? What are some connection points you've discovered to helping us understand and live the story more?
I think the biggest connection for me, which has been inspiring for me in my own life, is the importance of reading quality literature, because I can identify with how Frederick Douglass, when he first opened the Columbian Orator, and it was like it light shine. A matter of fact, that is why my first book is called Living in the Constellation of the Canon. The whole concept, there's a metaphor that is woven throughout my dissertation, and it's light. And light shined within Douglas when he came across these books. I have experienced that same thing. When I read either something from the Western canon or something that should be in the Western canon, there's something about the richness of that great conversation when these great thinkers start talking about the human experience that gives me hope, that shines light for me. And so I think it's that when I see that quote in his autobiography about how the light shined in his darkness, I can identify with that, because every time I read this literature, that's what happens for me. I'm actually kind of addicted to it because, and it's interesting. I put a post up one day on Facebook. Someone had written it about how if you're going to buy me a book, just don't, I'm very picky. Just buy me an Amazon gift card, right? Because there are just some books that I took a book. I'm not going to name it because I don't want to speak negatively about anyone, but it was a one. I had started reading this one book, and it was just dead. Like I could not. There no light shined for me. And the author is very famous, very influential. They have a lot of things to say. And I took with me on the cruise and another book on the cruise. I'm going somewhere with this, right? I took two books on the cruise because I wasn't sure which one I wanted. So I started with the first one, and it was so unenlightening that I left it on the cruise ship. I said, well, maybe one of the maids will find some use for it. I'm not even taking this off with me again. But there was the second book I picked up, which I picked last because I didn't think it would touch me so much, was a book by John O'Donohue, who I love. It's called Blessing, I think Bless the Space Between Us. He also wrote Anam Cara, and I quote him a lot in my dissertation as well. But that spoke to me, and he quotes a lot of the canon. He quotes a lot of scriptures, and just talking about each chapter is about how we experience life as human beings, and his constant reference to the Western canon and how he wove it into his writing, it spoke light to me. Like that, I began to read a chapter every night before going to bed on the cruise, and the light spoke to me. Nothing necessarily in my life changed except light shined within me. So that is a major connect. I'm going on and on about that because I feel like a lot of us have gone through that, where certain books just don't speak to you. They might be entertaining, right? It might be a love story or something that keeps you on the edge of your seats. But there's something about the Western canon that when you read it, something awakens in you.
Yes, I completely have had that experience as well. And so this is a great um, segue into one of the questions that came in about Phyllis Wheatley and about some of the things that she gained inspiration, felt illuminated from. I think the particular question is asking, do you know if any of Phyllis's works connect African myth to Greek myths or to the Bible? Do you know any of that history at all?
So this is Phyllis Wheatley does something that has actually kind of alienated her from the African and African American community. She denounces anything from African culture. Um, but we're not sure. We've been kind of reading through and we're wondering if there was a mask, if she was really doing that, or was there something else underneath it, as a part of her survival where she was. So she does it. She completely embraces the Western culture. And one of the reasons why I love Douglas is he does not denounce himself as a Black man. Matter of fact, he develops a strong love for Africa, right? And then another reason why I love Chinua Achebe is because even though he also loves the Western canon, this is the author of Things Fall Apart, he does not forget his heritage. And I think that's the big challenge because the Western canon is so powerful. It is easy just to only read that without bringing your human experience and other human experiences into conversation with it. But when we stop doing that, the canon actually will die. Let's process that for a minute. If we don't bring our human experiences in conversation with the Western canon, its growth will die. It will become stagnant. If we only make it about those who just read at that time. The canon was formed as a result of different human beings bringing their life experiences in conversation with the ancients. And that is how it continues to grow. It is a living organism. It is supposed to keep growing as we weave our stories into conversation with it. But Phyllis Wheatley she didn't do that well enough. That's the one fault I have with her. But we have to understand her human experience. She was very young. She wasn't even 30, barely 30 when she died, right? She comes to America through a traumatic experience at 7, not 17, at 7, all alone. So she was completely, all of her whole life was about survival. So we can't really judge her based on where we are. We have to have a level of grace for her, but hopefully not make the same mistake.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, how many of us remember much before 7 years old, and
Right.
especially trauma and
Trauma.
what we know about trauma and what it can do to the human
Yes.
memory? So, yeah, our interpretation of her should be gracious.
Yes. Very gracious.
So, question. Okay, well, accolades and questions. One of our participants says, "Tears in my eyes.
Oh,
I heard you at the Cersei conference a couple of years ago, and I loved it." She says, "I'm inspired
oh,
to ask my current 11th graders to try their hand at writing their next history paper as a story rather than
yes.
an essay.
Yeah.
Just heard you mention books that should be in the Western canon. Can you name one or two of those that you're
Hmm.
thinking of?"
Absolutely. I definitely think everything Chinua Achebe has written should be a part of it. He is a champion for classical education. He talks about it in his memoir. He talks about it in some of his, and he models some of his writing after Greek tragedy. So he should be in there. Anything from W.E.B. Du Bois. My latest one is he's not African American, but he's Irish. I love him. His name is John O'Donohue. He died suddenly at the age of 52 several years ago, but he has written such beautiful literature that often weaves in the Western canon. And the reason why I keep saying this is this: Mortimer Adler identified what the ancients were doing when they were, bringing their classical education. They believed in the Great Conversation. The Great Conversation, although we've kind of coined it in these modern times, it was not a new concept, right? We even see it in Jesus. Jesus did everything through conversation. So this process of gathering together and talking back to one another is the real way to educate. And that's what we do as classical educators and students. And so I think that Mortimer Adler recognized this pattern that, oh my goodness, these authors are referencing one another. They are engaged, and he took, I think it was like 40,000 hours to analyze from ancient times up to the time when he was alive, um, authors who had already passed away, how they engaged in conversation about common themes. And then he cataloged all those themes, and then he compiled all the books that are engaged in that great conversation. And that is how we actually got one version of the Western canon. So he's kind of my formula. So if the formula is the person they can't be alive, but they have to be from the past, and they have to reference something, a real good reference from the Western canon, covering some of those common themes, that is how you become part of it. Mortimer Adler did not mean for his work to stop. It is up to us to understand the philosophy behind what he did, as opposed to dismissing him as just a white man that wanted to collect white books, and understand that he was setting forth a formula that we all can, in our reading, identify, oh, wow, this author, and it's not about race. This is anyone, no matter what continent you're from, if they are having this conversation with the books of the Western canon, they are added in to the list. It's that simple. So it kind of helps us. From just. I told sometimes people will say, "Oh, we need to add some more books." I'm saying, "Well, just go get an English degree. Go study, Italian literature. Like that's classical education is very specific, right? It's about the study of this collection of works. The only thing we sometimes miss is we stop there. And Mortimer Adler did not mean for us to stop at when he was dying. He was trying to set forth something for us to continue. And he's given us a formula to do that. We don't need to fix it. It's a really good formula. It's already laid out for us. All we have to do is understand who else is having a conversation with this literature. And let's bring them in. Who else is trying to explain the overall human experience? let's bring them into conversation.
We have someone else who is so appreciating your manner of communicating
Mm.
important truths and ideas. Your oral storytelling is amazing, she says, and
Mm.
so engaging. It's a wonderful personal way to share and teach. Do you have advice for teachers without a theater background and or who may be more introverted?
Um, wow, that's such a great question. I've never had that question before. It makes me want to do a storytelling workshop. I think that when you learn someone's story, to really try to experience it, like feel it, like allow yourself to get lost in the person's story. I see you, Connie. And when I telling the story, I actually am mentally transported into wherever I am. And I started to see the auction block where Phyllis was. Right. I saw Douglas sneaking around. So and I would say don't think of yourself as a teacher, but you are a teacher. A griot is a teacher. That's how they taught, was through storytelling. But think of yourself as you want to bring this story to life. And you can only bring that to life once you feel it. So as you get into it, begin to imagine the environment, what the emotions could have been, make even some theories of what they could have been feeling, what could have been happening, and then begin to draw a picture of that human experience with your words. I don't know if that's helpful. I feel like there's so much more I want to say to that.
Oh, that's well, that's the need for the workshop. Um, I also wonder, sometimes it's helpful to just assign this to students
Yeah.
themselves, that you do the reading, you find ways to translate it into story, into drama, and I know
Yes.
you've done a great job with that, like, Anika, in empowering students to dramatically or artistically retell important
Yes.
stories.
Yes.
Um, so, I wanna give you the opportunity for any final words. Well, and we do have time for 1 or 2 more questions if anybody wants to submit anything. And then Dr. Prather, I definitely want to give you, the final word on anything that you want to say, share, emphasize. I feel that tonight has, for each one of us in our own way, been that encounter with illumination. Um it's a book we won't leave on the cruise ship. It's a precious gift for us,
Yeah.
what you've shared, and we're very grateful.
Yes. Yes. Um, I'll wait to see if anybody has a question, or do we just go on? Or
Well, I'm gonna invite anybody, any final words that anybody wants to put in the chat. I think we captured what was out of the Q&A. So if nothing comes in right away, I'd say you can just go on with any last bit of emphasis you have.
well, I want to say someone said I think earlier that they're thinking about having their students write a story as opposed to an essay. And I really want to encourage you to do that. There's something I'm trying to make into an academic term. Um, that enlists us telling stories in a way that's rooted in primary sources and evidence, not just drama. So everything I shared with you was connected to some type of primary source and proof to what I was saying. Um, oh, thank you, Joe Beth. And so I do want to encourage you to incorporate storytelling in your students' writing, their presentations. Um, Storytelling is a scholarly work. And the griot, that's why I call myself the griot. The griot is very important. The griot in African culture is why we know about African culture. With all that continent has gone through with colonization and the slave trade, it would have been very easy for our story to be forgotten. But because of the griots, there and here, we know ourselves. And that is the same for any other ethnic group. So storytelling is something that really should be given to everyone to share, to learn, to teach with. So I want to encourage you to consider doing that. And I'm going to think about that storytelling workshop.
Well, friends, I'm so grateful that you were joining us wherever you joined us from. I hope that your children, your schools, and everything have been enriched. I know that each one of us in our own way will carry the images, the inflections, and the import of what you've shared. Thank you so much, Dr. Prather. Thank you to you and your family, because I know that your family is sort of behind the wind beneath your wings, so to speak, and that they allow you to participate with us in these ways. And so a special thank you to them as well. And
Yes.
if you want to take a moment, we'll leave the chat box open for just the last few seconds so that Dr. Prather can enjoy your
And what I did, I just shared my email and I said if they have any more questions, they all can just feel free to email me. I'd love to answer them. Yep.
Oh, what a gift. What an amazing gift. And like I said to you all who are with us this evening, you will get the first news of when Dr. Prather's griot stories, her audio recordings, will be available through Classical Academic Press. So we will be sure that we send that out, and we'll send a recording of tonight's events with many of the links and resources that were mentioned and included tonight. Okay.
Thank you all so much for having me.
Right. We're so grateful. Thank you. And I look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Yes, ma'am. I'll see you soon.
Good night,
Bye.
everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Bye.